Start the recording. Start the meeting at 9:35. Today's the 22nd of February 2024. It's the Climate Action Committee. Just reflecting for a moment, it's been about a year since we've had this committee again this trinium, so really welcoming feedback from all the members about how you think it's working and everything else. But anyway, we will start with the karakia. I'll invite Karen. Could you open for us? Thanks.
Atamarie, join with me, please, if you wish. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia makina kina ki uta, kia mataratara ki tai, he I ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti he mauri ora.
Thank you, Karen. I'll draw the members' attention to the health and safety statement that is on page 6 of the agenda. We've got it in all of our committee meetings, so I'll take it as read. Just to be aware of for any of the others who have joined us who haven't come across it before, to have a look at that. And then apologies. I don't have apologies for non-attendance, but I do have apology for lateness from Tipa Mahuta and Pamela Story. I'll move those. Do I have a seconder? Thanks, Stu Kneebone. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Then the confirmation of the agenda. So we've got, I think, 4 key items today. And is it 5? Sorry. Yes. Thank you so much. And if everyone's happy with the order that it's in and the content there, I'll move that again. Do I have a seconder? Thanks, Mikhail. Then all those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Right. Are there any other disclosures of interest in relating to this agenda that needs to be raised? Be surprised. There's no major decisions in this, at least proposed from our staff. So in that case, I will move on and we'll go straight to our first item. Oh, well, one more thing I'd like to do is just introduce our new democracy advisor, Leah Newman. This is her first meeting, so please bear with us as we figure things out together. And I would invite the councillors especially to get to know Leah in the break, so that since you'll be seeing her for a little while still. Yeah, and I'll pass over to yourself, Karen. You can give an overview of what's today's intention for the meeting.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone. And just about today's agenda, we have 5 papers, as the Chair said. And I just wanted to draw your attention to the first 2 papers are really context and scene setters for us. So we have our principal economist, Blair Keenan, joining us to talk about these actual and projected impacts of climate change on our economy. And as we discuss with Blair the matters he raises, I'd really encourage councillors to think about, does our climate action roadmap, does it address the future in the way that we are seeing it play out now? And are we actually touching on the right interventions? So it's a really good opportunity, really food for thought, for us to think about what's the role of the Regional Council, and specifically, how does this committee focus on the actions we can take forward to all the other committees that each have responsibilities for ensuring that climate change response is incorporated into all of their work programs? Then we have a paper on the climate action roadmap and how we're tracking progress to plan. And the good news is that all of these actions, or in fact, I think the vast majority of them, have been incorporated into your long-term plan business cases and have been discussed through our long-term plan discussions and debates and decisions, so that we do have these interventions incorporated into all of our programs, which is a really positive thing for us to be able to focus on, and indeed we must monitor and report against them. Then the 3 papers that follow are, first one is an important adaptation paper about the water security implementation plan. We know adaptation is about responding to too much water. On the other hand, too little water. And I think Blair Keenan can give us some really good insights into the slow risk creep of drought. And it's something that kind of we haven't spoken about so much until these more recent years. Then the middle paper about our corporate emissions reduction program. We've been working to reduce our emissions since 2016-17. We were very, very proud of our progress, but we were always very cautious. We've called it the sort of no floods, no flight success story. And you'll see from some of the data we can show you, that's kind of all changed completely in just 1 year. And we squeaked in with 1% reduction in the last year. But we can have a brief discussion about that before we lead into the final paper, which I would advise that we spend a reasonable amount of time on. We have in the run sheet allowed for some time. This paper is about how do we both innovate while adapting and mitigating to climate change. And we have a very experienced consultant here to help us talk about how do we use the ETS, biodiversity credit schemes, how can we support landowners and indeed ourselves to mitigate our emissions, but prepare our landscapes so that we are more resilient to climate change. So I'm looking forward to that conversation with you. So thank you. And on that note, I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Sure, and thank you, Blair, for this first item. I particularly was interested in it because we see in the news the fact that 2023 was the hottest year on record. There's some pretty amazing raw, or processed data out there about things. We've seen the impacts of Cyclone Gabrielle here in New Zealand and the international shipping issues that have come about from a series of droughts and other things that have come along, floods and wildfires, and how that is important to us here in the Waikato is why we're here to help explain that for us, as Karen said, so that we can think about how we are best to prepare through the work of this council for our communities. So with that, I'll pass on to you, Blair. You might need to move it closer to yourself. White. You're okay.
Cool. Morning, everyone. So the may as well just move straight on to the first slide. We all know the story about King Canute, the English king back in 1,000 years ago, who supposedly took his throne down to the seashore to demonstrate his power of holding back the tide. And of course, he couldn't. But actually, the real story is a little bit different. He was doing it to demonstrate to all the sycophants around him that his power wasn't unlimited, and that it was only God that had the power to hold back the tide. I think there's a lesson in that story for us, in that I think if you're faced with the inexorable sort of stuff coming towards you, the question is, well, what do you do about it? Do you accept it and accept whatever the consequences will be? Or do you, as I suspect Knut did, move the furniture before things get out of hand? Next slide. So if we went back to 2015 in Paris, the global community came to an agreement to try and keep warming to less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with a specific attempt to keep it within 1.5 degrees. So that was 2015. In 2023, less than 10 years later, we blew through that 1.5 degree thing, at least according to some measures. And we're seeing a whole lot of records being broken in terms of air temperature, relative humidity, sea surface temperatures, ice cover. The list of records seems to go on and on. Now, it's true that there is a strong El Nino event going on at the moment, which tends to be associated with warmer temperatures globally. But with 2023, 24 already full of records, you wouldn't necessarily want to hang your hat on this being a one-off. Next slide. I can get you versions of that you can read if you like. Yep. So down here in the bottom of the South Pacific, surrounded by the insulating ocean, I guess the question does come up, to what extent is it our problem? And as these pictures demonstrate, you've got windfall forestry near Taupō, State Highway 25A. You've got coastal inundation at Kaiawa and farms underwater near Tiaraha. So, if we're living in an insulated part of the world, I'd hate to live in an exposed one. Next slide. So the Insurance Council of New Zealand's been collecting data or publishing data since going back to 1968 on the insurance costs of extreme events. I've taken the earthquakes out of that, so they're not really relevant. The 1968 event was the storm that drove the wahine across Barrett's Reef, and about 3/4 of that 1968 figure, the costs of that, the wahine ferry itself. So the other quarter of it is damage from the storm. I think there's a pretty clear trend happening towards the back end of this chart. There's two things going on there, I think. One is, the increasing damages that we're seeing, but part of that's being caused by what they call the expanding bullseye effect. So what that means is where you've got a growing population, more capital, more assets in a given area, when something hits that, the damage will be much higher. So I guess that explains part of that trend that we're seeing. Yep.
Question? Yeah, if you just put your mic on, go for it.
I'm just curious, the cost of natural disasters in New Zealand, there's an increasing claim thing going on. Is that because there's more infrastructure now than there was back in 1968, or is it for other reasons?
It's partly that. So that's what I'm sort of calling the expanding bullseye effect. When you've got a natural event that comes to an area, it's got a bigger target to hit. There's more capital in that space, more people. Yeah. So that is part of it. We can't necessarily untangle how much of it. So there is, there's more and more frequent events as well. But I suppose the other point in relation to that is that the fact that we've got more to lose doesn't make it okay. You probably noticed that there's no data for 2023 in there, and the next slide I've added that data. And you can see why I excluded it from the first one, so you could see that trend. 2023 not only broke records around the world, it broke insurance records here as well. So we're talking about an order of magnitude bigger than anything that we'd seen before. And that was almost entirely the Auckland anniversary weekend event and Cyclone Gabriel.
Just on that, presumably we're going to get increases in insurance costs, and that'll start to lay on top of rates increases as well, because you can't get a mortgage without insurance these days. So people are going to be suffering significantly.
That's right. Yep. So insurance costs will go up. In some cases, you won't be able to get insurance at all. And as you say, that then affects your ability to get a mortgage and things. So yeah, I hope that what we're seeing in that chart is not part of a trend, because it would be fairly alarming if it was. But next slide. So we've talked about the kind of acute extreme events that we've had in the last little while. We're probably also already seeing more chronic kind of effects of climate change. So heat stress on stock, droughts. We've seen multiple droughts since, I think it was about the 2008 one. And things like invasive species are becoming, the ranges are extending, and those sorts of things. So the picture up there is alligator weed, which is one of the world's most invasive pests. At the moment, it's, I think, of tropical origin, and it doesn't set seeds in our climate at the moment, but it potentially will be able to in future. So the risk that becomes a much more dangerous pest in future with climate change is very real. Next slide.
If I could, Blair, I was just wondering, in relation to your costs of natural disasters thing, I saw something in the news the other day, which I'm sure you did as well, findings from Lloyd's of London Insurance Risk Index report about New Zealand being the second highest in the world, just after Bangladesh, for risks of costs of natural disasters. Correct? Yeah. Thanks.
I'm not sure whether that includes earthquake risk as well.
Yeah, no,
So
I wasn't sure either.
Which does throw things out. So going back to those insurance numbers, if I'd included the Christchurch earthquake, it would the bar would be up on the 3rd floor.
But thanks for calling it to our attention. It's really relevant, obviously, for New Zealand.
So one of the most directly affected sectors is the primary sector, which for New Zealand, it makes up a little bit over 5% of the market economy, which is probably less than a lot of people realise. For the Waikato, it's about double that. For large parts of the region, it's a whole lot more than that again. Next slide. So even though as a share of GDP, the primary sector, and so, sorry, I should be clear that I've included in the primary sector agriculture, horticulture, arable, it'll be forestry, and I've also put in the key manufacturing sectors, food and dairy, meat and dairy, sorry, because those are directly affected as well. But the share of foreign exchange earnings that we rely on to keep us in the manner that we're accustomed is much, much higher than the share of GDP. So, we're talking about up to, well in excess of 50% of our foreign exchange earnings are reliant on those primary sector exports. And one of the things that we are being directly affected by is the fact that under those climate agreements that we talked about earlier, our customers, our export markets, are having to take account of our emissions. That's what they call scope 3 emissions, where effectively you need to account for the emissions from your from your supply chain, sorry.
Yeah, Ben.
Oh, I'd just like to draw attention to this slide when we come to the one about greenhouse gas emissions from peat. Because if 50% of our exports and income come from this, and you start to add in that enormous scale that you're looking at, it's something that needs to be looked at in the economic context as well as just the environmental.
It's a real conundrum.
Yeah.
Right, carry on, Blair.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
Stu.
Hey, just a quick one, Blair. Can we just go back? So on the slide here now, Otorohanga's at 30% on the slide and Waitomo's at 90. Can you back to the previous slide? It's kind of the other way around almost. And it's not a big, I don't get bogged down on it, but it just seems some interesting differences there that don't quite make sense to me, eh? Don't get bogged, but do you get what I mean? It's sort of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean the data for as you go to smaller and smaller levels, you can get funny things going on.
Yeah.
So, for example, especially with Waitomo and Otorohanga, if there's a dairy factory sitting on one side or another of a boundary, that can make a big difference to some of these numbers. Okay. So interpreting them does require a bit of local
All good.
ground truthing.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, next slide. So we're definitely going to be experiencing a lot more scrutiny from our the markets for our exports. But then, if the world is experiencing droughts and some of the food bowls and all those sorts of things going on, you'd have to think that people are always going to buy our food, right? And that's probably true. The two caveats, I suppose, are, first of all, are they going to buy it at a price that lets our growers make money? And the second one is there's a bunch of things that go into demand as well. So the top right chart there shows that the population of what has become our overwhelmingly most important market in China, especially for dairy products, which this region is particularly big in. The working age population peaked some years ago in China, and the total population is probably around about at its maximum, and it's going to start declining. So there's other things that go into the demand picture as well. We've also got, that bottom right one is, I think you alluded to it earlier, issues with the Panama Canal. You've got a whole lot of container ships lined up outside there. They can't get through because of the record droughts that are lowering water levels in Central America, and the water levels in the Panama Canal are just too low to get all those ships through. Now, all of that means that the costs of shipping are rising quite sharply at the moment. That's not just Panama, that's also what's going on in the Middle East, and possibly more so. And even though, if we go back to that question about, okay, but our markets are, dairy or wood products to China, for example, that doesn't have to go through either of those routes. But it does affect the cost of shipping, because the availability of containers and the availability of ships to carry these things is affected. Next slide. So all of these things have been a big part of the surge in inflation that we've seen in the last few years. The yellow line there is what they call tradable inflation or trade exposed inflation. So that's the sectors of New Zealand that are exposed to international competition. And you can see sort of at the height of that big peak that we had, that tradables inflation was really driving that. Next slide. So in the face of all these complex natural and economic and artificial systems that we've got all interacting with each other, there's a whole lot of uncertainty that generates. And so the question that you have to grapple with is, well, first question that you need to grapple with is, how do you deal with that uncertainty? Do you wait for it to resolve itself, to become clear what's going to happen? I'd suggest you might be waiting a long time. Or is it in itself a reason to act? So, the question is, if we wait for things to resolve, is it too late by then? And if it is potentially going to be too late, you've got to be pretty sure that the downside consequences aren't too bad. And I wish I could be confident that they weren't, but I'm not. Next slide. So what do I think is needed? Well, when we face these acute problems, extreme events and those sorts of things, the region needs to be resilient. In the words of Rocky Balboa, it ain't about how hard you can hit, it's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. When these problems are systematic and persistent, the region needs to adapt. Now we could say, the climate's always changed, and that's true. But we've also always adapted to those changes. History's littered with communities or whole civilizations that haven't done that, and they're gone. So this council, I think, through your long-term plan, climate action roadmap, through your statutory role as resource manager, you're well placed to support the region as it's trying to weather these tides. Thanks.
Thank you, Blair.
Are there any questions or comments for Blair in that presentation?
Go for it, Ben.
Yeah, two things. One is you don't have a slide in there about the costs that we owe to meet our climate change obligations by 2030. Can you comment on that? There's a figure of something like $20 billion. It's like, is that graph
For the region or for New Zealand?
New Zealand.
Yeah.
And then for New Zealand.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's in a, yes, that's right. And that's probably an omission.
That's a huge liability sitting there on top of a declining market in China and increased prices and costs.
Yep. Yep. And it makes it really important what we do nationally with the emissions trading scheme and those sorts of things, and how forestry is included in that as well. So there's a lot of curly questions in how we make sure that that obligation, the cost of meeting those obligations, can be done in the most cost-effective way.
And the second point, Madam Chair, is I'm often wanting an economic side of the argument, and I think this starts to put it. I'd like to see something like this come to full council or strategy and policy so that everyone else gets to see it, that's all. There's a lot of information, and if you do that, I'd like you to break out the graphs so that we don't have to peer into torrent of four, but
good advice. Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be focused all on climate change. It's just economic impacts of what's going on are useful to know. Yeah.
Definitely note that, and very open to that. And I know usually our chair of strategy and policy is here, or our chair of the council, but we're quite happy to do that with presentations already prepared, and we can have a chat with the chair about that. Great, Bruce.
Yeah, just one comment. Shama Birekwa gave a fantastic talk at the local government meeting in Whakatane before Christmas, which covered off a good number of these points and really focused on the economic thing without necessarily just talking about climate change. I think that was really useful, and we can access that. Yeah. In terms of strategies for how you respond to change like this, it's not just a one-off, it's not just a one solution model. I come at it from my interest in ecosystems, from the notions of how do you manage for resilience. And in ecosystems, which I think are an analog for economics, building resilience is about maximizing diversity. So diversity of land use, for example, instead of having all your eggs in the one basket. So have you got any comment on what strategies, what are the effective strategies in relation to economics rather than my model ecosystem?
Well, as an economist, I've got two models. I mean, the portfolio theory is quite consistent with you. That's the theory of having a nice diversified investment portfolio, where when some things go up, other things will go down, and over time you kind of smooth out your earnings. So there's support for that kind of approach there. The other, I guess it's probably a little bit dated now, but the theory of comparative advantage says do the stuff that you're good at and let other people do the stuff that they're good at, and then trade, and there'll be mutual benefits from that. And I think there's still some merit in that. And the Waikato region is clearly we have comparative advantage in being able to grow stuff. We have fairly benign conditions. We've got good access to infrastructure and ports and those sorts of things. So that's how we've evolved like we have. But I do think that does potentially, although that's probably enabled us to grow much more over decades, it has left us exposed to some risks. And I think, Ben, you sort of alluded to them earlier with, the peat soil issue. If you have to do something about that, that's a whole chunk of economic activity that will be affected. So we've left ourselves exposed, and the China chart as well is important. We've not only have we left ourselves exposed to a relatively narrow range of exports, but also to a narrow range of markets. And with the geopolitical situation in the world at the moment, that's a potential problem.
Thank you for that. That's
Thank
really
you.
helpful.
Councillor Kneebone?
Just a comment. Well, that theory just talked about, was it comparative advantage? Is that yeah? It seems to me that where we've gone a bit astray with that is that we haven't accounted for the true costs of what we've seen as our comparative advantage. Not all of it, of course, but that's why. And to me, one of the focuses on is measuring and being aware of the true costs of what we're doing, rather than just.
Yeah. And the theory of comparative advantage predates environmental economics.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, from my takeaway was that it's obvious that we are vulnerable. I'm always a fan of diversity, ecosystem or economic. My personal view also would be that because we are so privileged in New Zealand, many of us, as an economy, I think we have gotten quite comfortable, and I think we might have lost sight of what is a need and what is a want. And so in all these different spaces, I mean, the water security strategy is one way of addressing that for water. What is a need and what is a want? We're trying to do that with legislation nationally as well. We're looking at putting together the energy strategy, or as I like to think, an energy security strategy in a way as well, because there's a lot of moving parts. And again, what parts of our economy or society need powering versus we would like to? And it comes the same to food. So for me, the food situation, because of our advantage of being able to grow things and that diversity that would probably benefit from, and all of these shipping costs and exposures, geopolitics, I think it would be really great if this council were to go in a direction of looking at, with others, a food security strategy, or just some awareness of what are needs and what are wants, because we're not all going to just drink milk all day if ships stop coming or anything like that. So I think we're doing a lot of the right work, but there are still a couple of these needs areas where we could become more resilient as a community. And on top of that, I love the information that this council holds, and I really do still question whether we are getting it out to our communities, especially through our territorial authorities. So something I wanted to raise with the other members about maybe bringing back to next committee a way that this council and even this committee can work closer with them to get that information out and collaborate so that we're not duplicating things. We're sharing, especially from larger councils to smaller councils, so that others don't get left behind and so forth. So does anybody have a totally contrary view to any of that? Otherwise, we'll start wrapping up and moving on to the next item. No, we're looking good. Okay, well then, and I also want to welcome Bruce for coming in the middle of that item. Thank you. In that case, we'll just receive the report. Do I have a mover? Stu, seconder, and Ben. Thank you very much. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you, Blair. Thank you for that presentation, and I look forward to perhaps seeing it again in a different, larger setting. Then we'll welcome in Joy to present the second item, which is the Climate Action Roadmap update. Hello, Joy.
Good morning.
So we've adopted this in September. It's been about 6 months or so since then. Work has been underway, and it's either in work plans or in the long-term plan, or very few items not yet started or needing direction.
Okay, I'm
Please-
done.
You're
So
done?
I'll,
Yeah.
Yes.
So thanks for the new template. I'm going to give you a presentation and then we'll give our feedback. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So good morning to you all. It's nice to be able to be sitting here and sharing our progress from the Climate Action Roadmap that, as Jen rightly said, was adopted last September. There's an awful lot of work that's been going on around council, so it's great to be able to come here and give you some update and information. As you will know, that the roadmap, that's what we call it in short, identifies 9 evidence-based pathways to reduce emissions and to help us adapt to climate changes. The roadmap outlines the legislative, economic and social context for the Council's climate action response. And through that, it highlights the areas that represent the biggest challenges and the biggest opportunities within the Council's sphere of influence. And the details that are sitting in the actions are helping us to respond to climate change and, importantly, invite discussion and collaboration with others so that we can all develop agreed solutions. Next slide, please. So what does that really mean from a work in progress? Where are we and what do we need to be doing next? Apologies that the slide isn't very clear in front of you, but it is page 9 in your reports.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we've done since the release in September is kind of gone around the organisation and talked to many of the departments and teams that are actively working to deliver the roadmap. And so the report that you have in front of you is for a time period from October 2023 through to the beginning of February. And our intention is to do this on a regular basis so that we can provide really good updates, really good information, and be able to have good conversation about what is working, what needs support, what are the challenges. So it should give us a really good way of seeing how the climate action roadmap progresses. Now, within those 9 pathways, there are 109 commitments. So quite a stack of actions that we have committed to pursuing. You will see that 67 of them are in progress. 13 of them are in planning. 16 have not yet started. 5 are awaiting central government decision or direction. We have 1 that is completed, and 7 we're just waiting on some more updates. And I think for me, it's kind of be interesting to work with you to kind of work on those definitions of what in progress is, what planning is, and what you want to see and what would be useful for you. As we said, most of the commitments are already in flow, either as part of ongoing business as usual or being worked through as part of the LTP process. And some of the key projects have been selected and are highlighted in the report that's on table, that's page 11 of your councillor pack. And so what we've done is we've worked through the different pathways to draw out some of the key projects to kind of show how the roadmap is interconnecting with the work that we're doing. Now we have put all the pathways as green because we're seeing this as a baseline report. It is the start of the action, though some of them have been going on for a long time. And then as we develop the reporting and we get deeper into the different works that are happening, there may be different colorings we use, and we may change the definition of that. And again, that's a work in progress that we're keen to develop well so that there is line of sight from the strategic direction, strategic priorities through the LTP, through the climate action roadmap, so that we can actually see what we're doing and how well we're doing. One point to note is there is an awful lot of interconnectivity between the pathways and also the work that we are doing. So, for example, the infrastructure strategy touches at least 35 of the commitments within the roadmap. So there are plenty of programs that are interconnected and plenty of pathways that are also working in collaboration or overlapping. And what we intend to do is keep reporting against the commitments. We want to track them, monitor them, identify opportunities to storytell. So that kind of goes to the point you were mentioning earlier, Jen, and highlight priorities that we want to focus on. And as the reporting develops, so the detail of the activities will continue to be shared. And with that, today, we're looking at two pathways. So we've got a paper being shared from the water pathway and a paper being shared for the afforestation and planting pathway. Both of those reports, though recorded against one or two commitments, are actually connected to several commitments. And I think that interconnectivity is really important to kind of understand where do they sit, and different parts of programs will sit in different commitments and in different commitments. Next slide. So that was really a quick wrap up of the highlights and where we are. But for us, it would be really helpful and really interesting to get your feedback on the template. Any thoughts, any comments on what you would like to see moving forward? Because we'd like to develop this so that it is a very useful tool for all of us to be able to use.
Thank you, Joy. I've got a few comments here, but I invite anyone to go first if they have as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's not a comment so much as a question, and it relates to the peat soils, the greenhouse gas inventory, organic soils, greenhouse gases. Are these currently counted as part of New Zealand's 2030 climate change commitments, or are soils excluded? That's probably not a question you might know the answer to.
So within, so it's a regional inventory that's been done. Within our emissions, it's not currently included, but it has been identified and it is there.
And in terms of the government's commitments by 2030, are they are organic soils included in those at the moment or excluded?
From what I understand, I don't think they are included at this time.
Right.
Could we get Mike a mic? Mike a mic. I do appreciate the fact that he can answer this question. You just come and join, Joy.
So prior to the election, the national government indicated interest in looking at this very issue. So currently, my understanding is the organic, well, no soils are covered, although they are looking at the reporting requirements to do that. So it's not just an organic soil issue, it's a soil issue in general, because parts of the agricultural industry have pushed for the recognition of soils because they think it will be a net positive. Whether that actually turns out to be the case is quite debatable.
Yeah.
And in the Waikato, it might not be.
True.
Yeah.
And also in Southland.
Yeah.
Two major regions, large organic soils under agriculture is Waikato and South.
Yeah.
Thank you,
That's
Mike.
right. Thank you, appreciate that. Yeah, an involving space, that soil one. Right, anything else on the template from that Joy has provided? Feel free to give that feedback at any time. The notes I've got here, Joy, are thank you for this first one. Welcome you to keep evolving it, because I realize it's a thing that as more things evolve, you'll want to bring it in different ways that's useful for yourself as well as us, and as feedback filters in. But for me, the main points were, out of 109 things, or when you group these, for us as in a governance sense to see would be, as you said before, where are you really happy that it's working well? Where are things running as opposed to walking that you want to highlight so that we can get that sense, and where the challenges are, where we might need to think, right, so in future you may be coming to us about how to resource this, how to, that would be really good to point out in the report. It's kind of the highs and lows of the last 3 or 6 months of whatever's being reported. And then for me also, which items are so it's that relative importance. Where's the maximum impact? Well, we know that, for example, with peat or organic soils, huge impact being talked about when there is a change versus other things where they're really good to do and they might be a stepping stone towards a large thing over time, but it's a small impact at this point in time. So it's just try and focus us of what we need to be aware of. And I would really appreciate if there could be a link back to the regional greenhouse gas inventory or the corporate inventory with that relative importance of impact. It could be in the table, for example, or elsewhere, because ultimately we're doing these actions to make an impact on either of the inventories. That is the outputs, hopefully over time, of getting emissions down also. And then since both of those inventories do have improvement recommendations for future, I think it could be really good to have as part of this a section each time on what progress there has been towards the next inventory. I remember with the regional one, there are a whole lot of data issues that over time we might chip away at and be great for us to know. Or with the corporate one, it's that heads up, hey, it's been raining heaps. This is going to be another one, anomaly here coming up or something like that. That'd be really helpful. So that's my feedback. Did anything else come to mind for others? Otherwise, yep, go for it, Stu.
So just building on what Jen was saying, which I agree with. One of the things that always frustrates me is where we've got opportunities to make a difference, but the policy framework, either here, not so much here, but at central government level, hamstrings us from doing that. And hence we need to make sure that sort of stuff feeds into our submission process.
That we advocate.
Yeah, is this the place where we should be highlighting that or not?
I can see how there's value in that.
Sure, but just food for thought anyway.
Because that's a challenge, right? This is a big challenge in our way. And if we hear it here, we know in the next submission opportunity. I've heard that. Let's put it in.
I mean, one of the ones that's sort of a bit hot for me at the moment, always is, but today is the water security strategy and the challenges we've got. First in, first served and all that sort of stuff, you know. So we need to have that ongoing lobbying pressure to central government. Yeah.
So almost like some kind of mini rag status of whether it's being affected by policy or you know, just an indicator of some description maybe.
Yeah, because it's interesting, if I can jump in, it's interesting when you say awaiting government. It wasn't clear from this report which one is awaiting government, and so if there is any push we can do through our contacts, then
let me give you an example.
Highlighting that would be useful because it's something we can do.
Yeah. And differentiating, making sure we're clear that are we making minor feel good step changes or we're actually doing stuff that's making a difference, you know? Because it's a little bit too easy, but like the bloody airlines saying, oh, we're going to introduce disposable cups and all that sort of stuff, you know? I mean, really, it's
no, sure, okay, no, we can work on that, and that'll help kind of show.
Just food for thought. Thanks.
Appreciate that. Thanks. Okay, in that case, we'll wrap this item up for you, Joy, and you've got your feedback. Then if I move to receive the update report, seconder and Councillor Kneebone, then all those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you, Joy. I'll invite up Thomas Wilding and Mike Scarsbrook to talk about the Water Security Management Plan update. Welcome both.
Thank you. Okay, so go to the next slide if you like. So there's a agenda report we've put in there, which is an update on where we're at. You've heard through the LTP process what we're proposing over the next few years, and we'll wait and see if that gets confirmed for the long-term plan. In the meantime, we'll be getting organised for if that comes through. So what is water security? Got a UN definition there, which is quite broad, right? Probably broader than I think about it, and a lot of us think about part of water security, but they have a very broad definition there in terms of populations, safeguarding access to water. We've also got Te Ture Whaimana for the Waikato catchments, restore and protect the river. And then we've got elements of water security in our regional plan. You know, objectives for people should be able to take and use water. Next slide. So the challenge is that we've got reducing water availability that we've observed. Okay, changes, especially in the last 10 years. Droughts that have been more severe and longer duration. On top of that, we've got the increasing demand. Relates back to Blair's bullseye, expanding bullseye, you might say. And then you've got the impacts of those water shortage on populations on the right there, and impacts on ecosystems. Next slide. So water security. So background, we've drafted a water security strategy already. So the water security plan is a next step that's arising from that. And we have those strategic objectives around water this relates directly to. And as a consequence, we've got that long-term plan business case to develop it. And what we want to achieve this financial year is get set up, ready to hit the ground running next financial year if that comes through. Not wait until July until we start, thinking about how we're going to tackle this. The next slide. So the delivery of a water security management plan, going from a strategy to a plan. So for this financial year, we've got the process of the LTP, securing the funding, and we need to, we had some discussion through that LTP process about the importance of the scope of the project, defining that, making sure everyone's on the same page with what the limitations of that will be. And hopefully get the ball rolling in terms of a risk assessment is something we could start this financial year, looking at how the water security risk varies across the region. That seems like a bit of a no-brainer in terms of investing in that would be money well spent from our existing budgets. And also give some careful thought to the communication and engagement, who we're engaging with, a plan for that for going forward. So for next financial year, we'll need to establish a project team, including external expertise, and that's what that LTP business case is about, and a steering group, who are the people who are, we need to be calling the shots on that one. And yeah, we can identify and test some of those water security scenarios. Drought impacts on the Karakia communities, for example, scenarios around if topor drops below its minimum and Waikato river flows drop. Those sorts of things we can look at now. So, and going forward with a drafting a response plan, trigger levels, appropriate actions, and develop recommendations to reduce water security risk. Tailor those to different water users. Moving into year 2, stakeholder community iwi consultation, and then approval of that water security management plan. Next slide. Okay, so some of the we've had a roadmap done by our consultants, and so they've been experienced with in southeast Queensland. They had I've called it the Millennium Drought, where a lot of their basic supply systems were running down low, and there was a lot of lessons they learned from that. So lessons we can learn from a large population that have essentially run out of water, and the problems that come with waiting until you hit the bottom until you start acting. There's no point building a dam when there's no water coming in to fill it. There's no point, putting in a lot of the connections. It's a lot more expensive. So yeah, there's lessons we can learn in terms of anticipating and planning for water security problems going forward from them. That's been useful. And this diagram is one of the many things that have come from it in terms of the different restriction regimes they have as water levels drop. Next slide. Yep, so that's all.
That's you guys. Cool.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Any questions for Thomas or Mike on that one? Looking at the report, and thank you for summarising it. It seems like a sensible approach. One of the questions I had was on that governance aspect, whether you would be looking at having a councillor involved. And that would obviously come to the full council in due course. But is that what you're envisaging?
Yeah, good question. And I think that's what it'd be good to. Do you want to talk to that one, Mike?
Yeah, I think what we would be really keen on is council's direction on what involvement you would like in terms of the final scoping up of this piece of work. It's obviously a significant piece of work for the region, and yeah, I guess one suggestion would be a workshop of council to actually test the scope before we finalise the project management plan at the end of the financial year. So sometime over the next couple of months, sit down with you and really consider what the scope of that management plan will be.
Well, from my experience, it certainly can't hurt, but I do think that it's great when all of council has one or two people they can look to amongst their peers of who knows the in-depth parts of that project. So it happens a lot in, say, the transport space or in the climate space at times, although we're all getting better across all of them, but it definitely looks like a factor for success, so that one person they can look to to know the ins and outs. They can get all those little questions answered, which means that they all tend to stay on the ride for the whole time, yeah, without having to know that themselves. I'll pass on to Councillor Dunbar-Smith and then Kneebone.
Yeah, just the strategic water reserve. Do you want to explain more what you mean by that?
Do you want me to talk? So that was one of the learnings that Southeast Queensland water suppliers, regulators identified was it is that consideration of essentially we tend to set allocation limits and then allow people to take water up to those limits. But what if we also considered a more strategic allocation? And you might say, well, that's an added allocation for the river, or it might be an allocation that could be used in emergencies. So it's, I guess, it's a concept that they have suggested, and I think worth us testing here.
Isn't that essentially in the Waikato Lake Taupo? I mean, that's our strategic water reserve, because you're actually talking here about going below the minimum standards for Taupo potentially in a drought.
Well, I don't know, Thomas, if you want to talk about what's happened with Taupo, but it's there's a minimum level for Lake Taupo, and the operating regime that Mercury operates under only has a certain amount of storage volume within that operating regime. So there are changes that could be made to the way the Waikato system operates to increase the potential storage, but that would require a major reconsideration of those systems and consents.
And is that something you're advocating in this paper? Because that's what item F suggests.
Consider it, yes.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is about thinking longer term, you know, in terms of our individual resource consents and compliance. We're looking at kind of a 5-year time frame. Use a 1 and 5 year low flow in terms of reliability of supply. In terms of our regional plans and policy, you know, we're talking about a 10 or a 20-year lifespan of how much water is coming down the river, but we need to start thinking longer term, 50 years, 100 years. Queensland, they're talking 10,000 years. You know, we need to start thinking about the what if scenarios for those really severe droughts that you wouldn't consider if you're only looking 5 or 10 years ahead. And that's where you start looking at those different regimes for, you know, don't wait until those 1,000-year, 100-year events come around. Plan for those and have systems in place to deal with it. And one of the options there is that reserve.
And this is primarily for people having water takes that we control. It's nothing to do with water metering in cities so that they reduce their usage.
Yeah, no, the reserve I don't think is related to water metering. I don't think that's more the issue.
But I think we have to say that in terms of the demand side, that water use efficiency and what we can do around water use efficiency has to be part of that, will be part of this management plan as well. And there's really good evidence that water metering improves water use efficiency. So that would be likely one of the things we'll be looking at in this management plan.
Thank you.
Great, thanks for that. Councillor Kneebone?
No, I really like this. To my mind, urgency is of the essence. You're talking about some of the restrictions we have around existing consents and things like that, and the sooner we can start using some of the outputs from this to feed into our own policy and national policy, the better, you know, because otherwise it'll just keep being put in the too hard basket. And the whole concept of the wider regional multi-agency thing, I think, is a really critical part. So we take everyone with.
Great, agree with that. Then we will, if nobody else has got anything
more, then we'll just say thank you, Mike, and thank you, Thomas, for the update. We'll see you at some workshop in the future with the whole council, and yeah, appreciate what you've gotten so far.
Thank you.
I'll invite Joy Moya up again, and she will, oh, sorry, I'll just pass that resolution. Thank you. So Stu move, was it Ben second? Thank you. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Appreciate that. Right, so Joy is here to present on the corporate emissions reduction plan update and updating on our 7th audit that's just happened late last year, and showing us how vulnerable we are to not meeting our targets when there's a lot of rain. Hi, Joy. Oh, yeah, just make sure you've got the red light.
No,
Great.
is that better?
Yep.
Okay, so as you may know, we've been going for certification annually since 2016, 2017, and last year's audit took place on the 4th of October, and we had the intention and the desire to get a nice further reduction as we have been previously. But next slide there. As you will have heard already, we only and we're able to achieve a 1% reduction in our emissions against the baseline, which was unfortunate, but I'll go into detail, and it's already been mentioned already as to why that was. So our actual corporate emissions, just a figure that if you want to use within conversations, is 1,657 tonnes per CO2 equivalent, and that's excluding public transport. So that is our core WRC corporate emissions. That was 712 tonnes higher than the previous year, so 57% increase. And the reason, not surprising, and as has been already mentioned, there had been unusually high rainfall. And as a result, from an organisation, we had to significantly increase our flood pumping run hours, and as a result, that increased our electricity usage and diesel usage. So the weather was in charge. So if we move away from that and include our public transport emissions, so that's our tahuia, our bus, and our community taxis, when we add that together, our total emissions are 8,020 tonnes per CO2, and that's a slight increase from last year. Thankfully, we are still on track to meet our 68% reduction by 2030 if we take this year as an anomaly year. If we continue to have wet years, then obviously that becomes more difficult to get to our 68% reduction. But hopefully last year is a one-off for a while. Next slide. What I'd like to do is then just dig into the numbers just a little bit. There are an awful lot of numbers within these kind of inventories, but I'm keen to kind of share the core ones that are useful for you to be able to share as you need. Non-surprising, the most significant emissions were diesel and electricity. So diesel was 53% of our emissions inventory, and our electricity was 29%. So both significant amounts. The emissions just from diesel, which were 884 tonnes, is 195% increase from last year. We purchased over 119,000 litres of diesel in order to meet the need for ensuring that we were able to do the necessary flood pumping. And as a result, our electricity, that went up 266% from just over 2 million kilowatt hours to over, well, nearly 600 million kilowatt hours. And from a CO2 perspective, we went from 258 tonnes of CO2 up to 475 tonnes. Natural gas, which is here in Ward Street, that was only a slight increase of 5 tonnes, but still an increase. And our domestic air travel increased once we were back from COVID and back to working normally. That increased from 21 tonnes up to 89 tonnes. So an interesting year where things had increased. And just to look at the public transport emissions, I've put the last 3 years there just to give you an idea of how things are changing. And I'm happy not to go into the detail, you know, but they're there for you to look. But I kind of want to say that for the public transport, if we look at the year this last year, 22-23, it was a reduction of CO2, even though it was the same service. And this is because the methodology improved. So whereas before we'd been using averages, this time we were able to actually do a lot more specifics on the routes themselves and from start to end. If there was a change of direct speed limit along the journey, then we were able to account for it. So it was somewhat more, we were able to be more accurate. And that has obviously reduced the CO2. To Huia, you will see that that has increased a lot, and that is predominantly because it's a full service now. And it's running to what it was expecting to do, whereas previous years it hadn't quite got there. So that's the, and what I've tried to do is just pull out the major sources of emissions to share with you. And then the last point in this slide, we also completed what's called a significance assessment. So this is driven by Toitu, and it's a request for us to start digging into our category 3, scope 3 emissions. And so that is for us to start looking at our supply chain. Where are these emissions coming from, and what do we need to do to mitigate them, and what is the process to enable us to do that? And to start with, what we are doing is identifying our top suppliers and identifying our top categories, and then overlapping the top category with the top supplier to come up with a top list of suppliers to look at. But that'll be a development program over the years as we move forward. Okay. This next slide is just the actual carbon zero roadmap to 2030. Very simplistically, on the left-hand side, you'll see the arrow in the middle. On the left-hand side is our usage to date, and everything to the right side of the arrow is our projected expectation and targets. You'll see the lovely coloured bar in the middle. That is last year's emissions, and clearly shows that the diesel and the electricity in the middle, the grey and the orange, are significantly bigger than they have been previously. There's lots of other information on there if you would like to have more conversation about that. Just note at the very bottom along the right-hand side, you'll see a little red bar beginning to show. That will be our solar that has been installed at Ward Street and at Pairoa and Northgate later this year.
Joy, could I ask 2 quick questions on this one?
Yeah.
One is, how come we didn't have any solar this 2023 already? I would have thought we might have.
So for last year, 2021, 2022 to 2023.
Right.
So Pairoa was installed in March of that year, and then Ward Street, installed and commissioned, and then Ward Street was installed and commissioned in October.
Okay.
So I have got some figures.
Yeah, sure. So it's
that
just the timing.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And my other one was, you see the little green bar at the top of all of the bars on the left. I don't see any green on the right, which looks like it's natural gas. It just looks like, are we suddenly not going to use natural gas in the next few years? Or is that something I've just picked up because I looked at all the colours?
The plan was when we moved into this building that we would not be using natural gas.
Right.
We don't own this building, and we moved in, and to our surprise, we found that they did in fact have a boiler, but that's still a conversation with the building's owner.
Great, thank you. That makes sense of that. And we'll carry on, Joy.
No, thank you. Yeah, right. So obviously we've shared where we are and what was happening last year, and obviously we're 2/3 or over halfway through the next financial year. So the next inventory will close in June. So we're already kind of working our emissions reduction plan for the year. The key headlines for us is to ensure that our air travel emissions don't exceed our 84 tonnes. Obviously, now that we are kind of back to full working in normal terms, we want to be able to keep an eye on that and not to let that go beyond. As I've mentioned, we are continuing to look at ways at how we are reducing our core energy. And I mentioned solar at Pyro, at Ward Street and Northgate, just to give you a very up-to-date kind of idea, and it is a work in progress, and there will be more when we get into the end of this year. So far, between the two solar schemes, over 95,000 kilowatt hours of solar have been generated. And within that, we have saved 58 tons of CO2. And obviously this will keep growing, and when we get to the end of the year, obviously it'll be slightly different. Interestingly, obviously we generate solar Monday to Sunday, but we're in the office Monday to Friday. So the energy that we are generating Monday to Friday, we are using. And then the energy that we are generating on Saturday and Sunday, we are exporting back to the grid. And it's a small figure at the moment, but we've recouped over $2,000 from exported energy at the moment. And obviously that will continue. We haven't had a full summer yet, so it'll be interesting to understand what the full summer trend is and each season beyond there. But good news. And obviously if we get Northgate, then that will be great too. We're continuing to decarbonise our vehicle fleet, and we have 11 EVs at the moment, 14 plug-in hybrids and 21 chargers here in Ward Street. So that is continuing. Mentioned about the supply chain, and we are looking at our waste stats. There will be some developments of that over the next few months as well. So those are the headlines of what we are doing. And then, but obviously, in an ideal world, we'd like to get to a stage where we're able to reduce all of our emissions down to zero. But where that is more difficult, then obviously we are looking at other responsible ways in which to do that. And obviously upcoming next is the Nature Positive Carbon Neutrality Framework, which is one of the ways in which we're going to be looking at how we offset the additional emissions. And just a note of interest, the emission factors keep changing. So it is something that we're having to be very mindful of when we're actually creating the inventories, because that requires rethinking how we re-baseline back to the beginning. So that's just an interesting piece of information. So as the grid decarbonizes and other methodologies of emission factors improve or change, then that's a continual moving beast for us.
Yeah, thank you, Joy. I do wonder whether maybe the next year or the one after, really the crunch time comes where it's just easier to set new baselines and start again, rather than trying to explain this all the time. And nobody likes getting confused by emission factors.
No,
yeah. And because it doesn't look real.
Yeah, because it's always changing. You're never quite sure what's real and what's not.
And I think we might be at a stage then to show our scope 3s, which in my mind now are public transport, peat soils and organic soils, and supply chain, so that they can show up in all the graphs in their own little colour and everything else, and we can see the relativity properly. But we're just not quite there yet, but the organic looks like we will be. So that would be a good time, I think. If I let Clyde go first, and then Ben, and then Stu.
One in there. Just two things. Electric fleet.
Yep.
So that's the petrol diesels are phased out 2030. What sort of fleet are you going to need for electric? Size of fleet?
The actual size of the fleet, or the type of fleet?
Well, both, yeah.
Okay, so from the size of the fleet, then I would need to ask our Transport colleagues, because they are working on a plan for that, the property and development. The type of fleet, well, from what I understand is that we are always looking at what's the right vehicle for the job from a fit for purpose perspective. And so that we are looking at the total cost of ownership for any vehicle that we purchase, so that we can still continue to buy the right vehicle for the right job. So ideally there will be, it will keep reducing to EVs and plug-ins.
Hydrogen or not?
It's a good question. I'll find out.
And one other thing, I see there's the reduction in the grey working from home.
Yep.
Can you explain what's going on there?
Okay,
Thanks.
so no problem at all. So what we're trying to do is understand our emissions for people in work and working from home. So it's a very, very straightforward calculation. We know how many desks that there are within Ward Street, for example, and we can do a calculation every day, or there is an automated report that tells us how many people are in the office. And then from that, we make a calculated assumption as to how many are not in the office. So it's very kind of basic, but it's helping us understand that trend.
And how does that impact, though? It looks like is it better to have people at home or in the office?
What I would say is it's a requirement from Toitu to kind of really understand that. I think for us, it's more about what's the right culture for us to kind of, if people want to be at home. Yeah.
Is the work getting done, that kind of thing?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's an ever
mixture.
evolving conversation, because obviously if you're at home, you're using different emissions. You're not using the office emissions, and if you're in the office, then you're obviously
Using our natural gas to heat the office.
yeah. So yeah, it's something as we understand more, it'll be something we can think about.
Okay, thank you. Ben?
Yes, obviously our ability to meet carbon zero is quite fragile when you can see what happened last year. What happens? Do we have any statutory obligations to meet 68% by 2030, or is that simply our internal visibility?
My understanding, Karen, you
Sorry, I was just going to say that was a target that we set in consultation with the council because it was achievable, affordable, but it was always going to be constantly reviewed as we became more competent at emissions management. And as the chair has noted, it is probably timely for us to actually reduce or to review our baseline and consider what our targets are.
Although it's interesting how in 1 year we can suddenly go back up to where we were
Yes.
if climate is changing and we're getting, yeah. So the second point is this one on nature-based solutions. It appears that tree planting is one of the few ways we have of dealing with emissions that we can't deal with otherwise. Are we going to move away from Toitu, given that they are no longer taking account of tree planting as an option?
So really good question. And in the next section, we will talk a lot about that. The Toitu is a quandary that we need to think about, because they are moving to looking to get their verification for carbon credits internationally rather than within New Zealand. So it is part of the complexity of how we will develop the framework over time.
So we may not continue to use them as the monitors for even our internal roadmap.
It is definitely up for discussion. Yes.
Thank you.
Right. And we can cover that more off in the next item as well. For me, I thought it was really interesting having the supply chain item finally in there and seeing the relativity of that, including the fact that it's been trending up over the last few years. Well, that's how it looked on one of the tables. We had 2017, 2022 and 23 on page 22. And it went from 4 to 30 to 54. So I just thought that was interesting. Something to keep an eye on, because I'm often advocating for our council becoming more self-aware of our material footprint rather than just our energy and emissions. And so when I had a look at your summary of how you're looking at figuring this out, I just thought it'd be really cool in one of the future meetings to get a report on where you're getting up to with that. And one question that just popped up for me was, do you think there might be any, or can you screen for where there might be small spends, but where there might be a high impact of emissions, say? Is that part of your plan?
So the whole thing with the supply chain, it is really understanding how you want to have a sustainable supply chain, especially when you have so many
Where to
suppliers. Exactly. So you start with the financial review, and then you look at material impact, and then you start to prioritize what contracts and items you really want to focus on. So yeah, there's a well-established methodology for working through that.
Okay, and I want to thank Ben for highlighting our vulnerability of meeting our targets of with this extra pumping that had to happen. One thing I was curious about was, since that diesel for those generators, for example, needs to be paid for, is that paid for from more of a general rate or more of the catchment scheme targeted rate combinations? I'm getting from Karen here, it's more from the zones themselves. So it's good to understand where that cost lies. And I'm mindful that people paying those are giving us strong feedback all the time that they don't want to have those costs. So it really reinforces with our infrastructure strategy and our other bits and pieces that, there is vulnerable to, there's rising costs there from a year like that as we are on our emissions profile. And I do wonder as well since it's hard for us to budget for anomaly years like that what if the ETS price goes up in time and we have quite large fluctuations in this space? I mean, it's always in the grand scheme of our budget quite achievable, of course, but it's just a vulnerability I'm really uncomfortable with. So I was wondering whether in future we spend some time in this committee diving deeper into where exactly those emissions and those that came from, to try and understand from that catchment side geography of where that's from. So just putting that out there, so that we know what's making us so vulnerable. Just
So
a bit of a deep
understanding
dive.
the diesel and the electricity
Yeah.
increases.
So now that that's happened,
Okay.
why did that happen and where did that happen, so that we know the names of the pumps or the
Right.
yeah.
That we can do.
That'd be really interesting.
Yeah,
Karen?
through you, Chair. We do have all that data because all of this is captured
Yes.
for each pump, each meter. So we have quite granular data about where the costs are derived.
Yeah.
What's interesting, though, is through the infrastructure strategy, our ICM staff are very interested in exploring technological solutions to reducing the reliance
Yes.
on diesel. So we're looking forward to some innovations coming through there that will start feeding into this work program as well.
Yeah, and while obviously all of that could go to ICM committee, I'm mindful it's got quite a lot of content already, and we are particularly interested in this vulnerability here, so it might be worth testing it here first and then taking the most interesting parts to them as they think about all of that, just so that we have that visibility why we're vulnerable. And then very last point was, I just had some other small bits of feedback on the actual report, but I can give those to Karen another time. Any other questions either side of the table on this one? Thank you, Stuart.
No.
Yep.
It'd be interesting because at the time when the diesel was put in, because some of those pumps on dry years, as we know, don't get used, and the standing charges were blooming through the roof. That's why they made them diesel. If you're doing that exercise today, you might not do that because there's a whole bunch of other factors that are there, And I guess at some point it may or may not become feasible to go back to electricity again. I just don't know, but yeah. And of course, they're not all agricultural either. Of course, there's big diesel ones at Pyro as well that protect the town of Pyro as well. So yeah, they're targeted rates, of course, but
Yeah.
in that targeted urban catchment as well.
I just imagine that next level of detail will be really interesting for us. Okay, well then, thank you, Joy. If I move to receive your paper.
Yep.
Joe. Or Mikhail, we'll have you second, and then all those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. We've got one more item, if that's all right, then we'll just power on through, and then we hopefully finish somewhere around half an hour or so. Or does everybody need a quick stretch? Okay, we'll keep going. Kia ora, Mike. Got Mike Jepson here to present the Nature Positive Carbon Neutral Framework Phase 2 update. And Joy, I had you on here as well for up there, but you don't need to be. Mike's got this. Great. Great. So welcome, Mike. Look forward to your paper on this. I could read out something, but I might just let you launch straight in.
Absolutely. Kia ora, everyone. So some of you know me from previous lives, and in fact, I think this is probably the third time I've talked to this council in various capacities. So I was very
First
interested.
time in person, I think.
Yeah, first time,
Welcome.
I was very interested in the water availability and security update, and it's good to see the council's working on that because that's very close to my heart since I did some work on that a couple of years ago that I
recall.
presented to the council on. I think this is a very good juxtaposition with your last presentation from Joy, and there will be relevant considerations. I do, although there's not a large number of slides, there's quite a bit of information. So what I'm going to suggest is I just try and go through it, and then we can go back to matters of detail if that suits.
Sounds good. Yep.
Cool.
That's always best for time as well.
Yep. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So the purpose is really just to give you an update of where we're getting to in the development of the Regional Council's framework to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. And as Joy's already talked about, the really important, there's two parts of this equation. There's what you do in terms of emissions to reduce, and then what's the balance left over to, offset and to achieve carbon neutrality. I think another important consideration is which of the emissions are you actually trying to achieve full carbon neutrality on? Because as I'm going to touch on, you've got a couple of big challenges, particularly in one area. I also want to talk a little bit about the toolbox of options for, creating carbon emission offsets. And I assume most of you are very familiar with that sort of language. That's the creating a carbon sink using planting of forests and other natural to suck out carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, equivalent volumes to the amount that's been emitted to the atmosphere. So that's really it. I do want to talk about the land options, but also about the types of planting that you might do, because it's not just plant one way. There is a spectrum of things that you could plant to achieve carbon neutrality, and they have different costs and benefits. And I think that's quite important when you think about the Regional Council's broader responsibilities in terms of water and regional resilience and biodiversity and a whole range of other factors. I'm only going to briefly comment on some of the challenges and complexities. One of them's already been raised this morning, which is the Toitu position on that that's not the only complexity in the space. So perhaps if we turn to the next slide. So we've already talked about the interim target of a 68% reduction. And that's obviously, that's not including your scope 3 emissions, the land transport, and the emissions associated with your drainage systems. So as Joy's mentioned, that's on track, given hoping that there's not too many anomalies like last year. And I think there's quite an emerging pathway in terms of your core emissions, not only to 2030, but out to 2050. That's very achievable based on the level of emissions in terms of core emissions. There's obviously a much larger challenge if you take on the challenge of trying to offset your land drainage emissions. It's orders of magnitude more that you would have to do for those sort of emissions. But having said that, that's also an issue of what you do in that space to reduce emissions where possible and where practical and where sensible, noting that that's a major source of your agricultural production is on that land drainage soils, and what you could do to offset some of those emissions. So perhaps if we go to the next slide. So I've already touched on, there's two parts of carbon neutrality. That's the second part of the equation is finding the carbon sink project options to remove an equivalent amount of CO2 from the atmosphere. And given the council itself owns a significant amount of land, one of the first options is to actually think about what you could do on land the council already owns. So you may or may not be aware that the council owns 3,900 hectares or thereabouts, of which 2,500 hectares is essentially bare land. It's actually, a lot of it has been farmed, but it has some complexities. So that's, as a starting picture, you've got some land there that you could look at carbon offset projects on. There is a range of potential complexities and complications though, so it would be probably quite challenging to plant up all that 2,500 hectares. The other land you own, you know, some of it's residential, some of it's, you have a little bit of forestry, so you can't really create new carbon sinks in forestry. You could improve the carbon management, so there might be some marginal carbon benefits in how you manage land that you own as forestry, but it's probably not as big of opportunities as actually establishing and planting, particularly forests on what is currently bare land. The modelling we've done to date has been, we've got some estimates of carbon offtakes for a couple of treatment options for projects. I would have to say at the moment, they are indicative only at this stage because they need to be calibrated with the sort of planting that the council is currently supporting. So we to date have used the model available that the Waikato Regional Council already has in terms of the carbon uptake of establishing native forest. There is some other estimates that we can get. There's carbon lookup tables the government operates for planting natural forest. They're actually a little bit more generous than the numbers generated by the council's carbon calculator, but I'm assuming that the council it's been calibrated more for your own conditions. So we're using that as a base, but it has to be calibrated. We've also, you know, there's been some modelling out to 2030 for carbon neutrality out to 2050. You actually have to model what your emissions look like right out, you know, over the next 25 years. And there's been some good work done on that. We're still waiting on a proper estimation of where those public transport emissions might go over that 25-year time span. So at the moment, we've just chucked in an assumption of a reduction over time. You know, if nothing else happens, you know, electricity, you know, they're looking to decarbonise the fleet. So there will be some improvements in public transport emissions. So on, now, before I go on to that, I just wanted to refer to the slide and the picture on the slides in front of you. So those pink and a little bit of yellow areas are the peat soils in the Waikato that your drainage systems currently drain. So it's 4,000 hectares. Collectively, the peat soils in New Zealand, it's about 1% of land, but it's, you know, 7% of our emissions in total or something thereabouts as a country. So it's a major source of emissions. So let's go to the slide. So on the next page, there's a little animation. So if I could ask you just to start the animation. So what the slide does, those blue bars are a projection on a yearly basis, or actually every 2 years, of what your corporate emissions would look like out to 2050. So that's showing an 80% decline out to 2050. The orange bars is if you add the public transport emissions into that. So that gives you a sense of the relative scale of public transport versus your core emissions. If you actually want to put in that other scope 3 emissions, you've got to actually change the scale, because that's what that, so you don't even see the little blue on that graph of what your corporate emissions is. You've got, you know, in the order of 900,000 tonnes per annum, which is associated with the soils that you drain for your drainage systems, you being the council, of course. So that's, you know, you're talking at orders of magnitude differences in emissions when you look to try and offset that level of emissions. So the slides change back now to, you know, just the trend down of your corporate and your public transport emissions. So let's go to the next slide. So this is where some of the toolbox options for where you might want to plant. So I've already mentioned, you know, the up to 2,500 hectares of, you know, bare land that you actually manage. That's obviously somewhere where you could start doing some planting on some of that land where it was feasible, practical, and there weren't other barriers that prevented you doing that. There's also the ability or the possibility that the council might strategically acquire blocks of land, and it might be specifically for this reason, but there are some other reasons why the council might want to acquire land, because it's farmland where the drainage system's no longer working. The cost of trying to continue to drain that land is not economically feasible. It's not becoming, so the option of continuing to farm that land is going to be problematic for the farmer themselves. So there may be areas that could be purchased, reasonably significant blocks that would really help you get on your way of carbon neutrality. There's another option that I've put on the table, and it's something that I explored when I was at Q2 National Trust. I used to be the CE there, and I went to Australia and looked at the revolving land protection funds operating over there, and that's where you acquire strategically a piece of land, make the land change, potentially put some covenants in place as well to help protect it, and on-sell it. And in this case, you would on-sell it with a carbon sharing agreement with the future owner, given your investment to try to establish the carbon offset on that land. And the benefit of that is that recycles the capital cost of purchasing that land and also reduces the ongoing cost of management that would occur to council maintaining that land, because that would pass on to the next landowner. So I think that's, depending on how much land you need, that might be a potential option, particularly if you can't afford to buy too much land, outright. The other option, of course, is doing partnerships with other landowners, and in this case, it's territorial authorities, the Crown itself, in terms of unallocated Crown land or other blocks of Crown land, Maori landowners or private landowners in general, and that's. Now, you would do that potentially as an addition to the sort of support that you're currently offering. You'd probably have to offer more support to justify getting any carbon benefit from that sort of investment. And, you would only, that would be a sharing arrangement with the landowners, any benefit arises. Now, we're also factoring in the potential that this might not only be a carbon sharing benefit, but if the biodiversity credit market gets off the ground, the benefit that might arise from that scheme as well. So we would think about any planting regime and that concept, whether it would potentially position for a future market for biodiversity credits. If you didn't want to do any of those options and you still wanted to achieve carbon neutrality, there is obviously the option of just going to the market and buying carbon NZUs if you were buying New Zealand emissions units, or from the voluntary carbon market, and then retiring those units as a carbon offset to your remaining emissions. That's now, depending on what market you use, that could affect the credibility of both the carbon benefits, and it might be quite hard to achieve biodiversity benefits in your region through that route, but it's still a possibility. So next slide. So I touched on the fact that you can actually plant in a number of ways to achieve a mix of carbon, financial and biodiversity benefits. And I've actually laid it out as a spectrum. Now, some people might argue where I've positioned things in that spectrum, but on the left-hand side of this, it's that production pine forest, where you establish a production pine forest, you are going to harvest it, but you're also going to optimize it to achieve some carbon credit generation as well. That's well understood under the New Zealand emissions trading system. There's more recently, people are looking to just permanently establish forests using Pinus radiata. A number of people are pushing the concept of establishing what they call a transition forest. So they start with Pinus radiata and try and manage it so it ends up in a semi-natural space over 50 to 100 or whatever many years. There's a number of options also of where you might want to do a planting regime where you might want to maximise also Manuka honey production, or actually plant native forest where you are going to do some limited harvest of native forest as well, single tree extraction. That's quite a well-known model. And then when you've got more pure biodiversity and carbon focus, that's where you might be re-establishing native forests or working to enhance natural restoration by retiring areas fencing them out, etc., and also creating wetlands. Depending on the options that the council might want to invest its time and money and focus on, it will change the mix of costs, benefits, biodiversity, and what other benefits might be achieved as part of these planting regimes. So let's go to the next slide. What I've done with this slide is it's really trying to dig out some of those other drivers that might influence the sort of projects that the council might be interested in investing in. Like if you were just interested in maximising carbon, the cheapest option is pines. It's at the moment, there's no question about that, particularly when you take a short-term focus of 25 to 50 years. Native forests, if you establish them, they will run longer. So if you're taking 150, 200 year, you might want to push more that way. But if it's a straight carbon play with a short term, looking at the net present value of money and reasonable discount rates, and people generally are planting carbon at the moment. But there are options where one of the considerations is, one of the drivers for the council is you're wanting to help this region transition to a low emissions economy. So in that sort of space, if you were doing partnership type plantings, you mightn't want to focus on that sort of planting. You might want to focus on a different mix. If you want to put a real strong focus on restoring the biodiversity of the region, as the national policy statement on biodiversity is encouraging all councils to do, that's when you would really want to look at some of the systems that aren't so clearly financially focused, but have a strong biodiversity benefits. Another relevant consideration is if you were to go down partnership options, what you might want to do with your iwi partners, Māori landowners, and also how that might relate to the sort of commitments you made as part of the Waikato Tainui Treaty Settlement Act commitments to work in partnership. And of course, the other thing about this, which is a really interesting part of this debate about where you might re-establish native vegetation or other vegetation, is how could you use that to also achieve the purpose of improving the resilience of this region to floods, droughts, your key infrastructure, because depending on where you might focus that investment, it could have real benefits in reducing risk of erosion, tempering the flood peaks, and flood events, etc. So it's not really simple choices here that you need to think about. It's what you might do in this space and how it works with the other strategies and the important priorities of the council. Obviously, though, money always matters because you've got ratepayers, and so that's where you also need to consider whether there are other opportunities for revenue, be it incidental like manuka honey, whether it's small scale planting, whether your planting regime will actually avoid other costs that the council might incur in terms of your investment in infrastructure. So a whole range of considerations here. At this point, I think we can come back to this because I think this might be quite an interesting part of your discussion about this, but I just want to turn now to talk about the likely scales of planting that might be needed depending on your emissions. I'll have to caveat this, and both on the emissions side, we don't have the full picture yet, and we are basing this on some approximate assumptions around just a couple of the planting type regimes, particularly planting nursery grown shrubs and trees into pasture to recreate a natural forest over time. So the numbers are based on that. Depending on other planting regimes, you would need less or more area planted. Now, I've developed a bit of a model to support this program, and what the model's shown that if you were just worrying about your core emissions, and you would only need to plant a very modest amount of land. We're talking 1 hectare a year for 21 years would, based on the current modelling, achieve your core emissions, no problem. Soon as you want to step it up and move to, oh, sorry, let's go to the next slide. So if you want to move to offsetting to achieve full carbon neutrality for your public transport emissions, it's a step up in the area, but it's still, it's 10 hectares a year. Starting from next year, planning for the next 21 years, so 210 hectares in total. That's very potentially durable, although obviously you need to look at the cost and how much you would do on your own land versus in partnership with others. As soon as you do it in partnership, you need more areas because you have less carbon benefit, etc. The issue when you talk about land drainage is whole orders of magnitude. So, remember I mentioned you had about 2,500 hectares of land. You'd probably have to plant more than 10 times that amount over the next 21 years to offset that emissions by 2050. But as soon as you plant it, if it's achieved by 2050, beyond 2050, there would be a lot of surplus emissions because of the slow growth rate of forest, and then they start taking off and really hitting their stride, 10, 15 years out from initial establishment. I'm going to touch a little bit on the model, but stop me if this is getting into too much detail because I know people, I just wanted to put those big numbers out there, but let's go to the
really
next.
appreciate that slide. Thank you.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide. So this is the sort of outputs that you put into the model. So what you do is you work out what the emissions that you're trying to offset. So this is a 25-year, well, in fact, the model has 50 years of emissions starting next year, running, for 50 years from that, so, 2075. So you have that side of the equation. It has feed input based on growth uptake of forest. If you establish 1 hectare of forest in 1 year, that generates so much carbon. If you do 10 years in 1 year, that 10 times that amount projected over time. And so what this model says, if you look at the orange lines, so the orange line is your net emissions, not your gross emissions, your net emissions. So you start with, in this case, it's about 5,000, is it 5,000? Yeah, 5,000 tons of CO2 per annum. So this is your core and your public transport emissions. So the point where the orange line, it starts to close up to the x-axis because as you start to plant, you start to offset some of those emissions over time. And the point where your net emissions crosses the x-axis so the orange line becomes above is the point where you have achieved annually from that point emissions neutrality. The reason I put in the blue line is because you weren't offsetting all your emissions prior to 2050, you build up a deficit of emissions that haven't been offset. So the model actually shows that on planting regimes, when that deficit of previous emissions prior to 2050 are offset as well. And in this case, that is achieved about 2063, so 10 years later. So annual emissions and all your emissions are offset by 2063, but from 2050, your annual emissions have been offset in terms of carbon neutrality. There's a couple of quirks in this model. Actually, if you run the animation, because there's an animation on this model as well down the bottom.
Just started it?
Yep, yeah, it does. Yep, it is starting to go. So in this animation, you put in the number of hectares you're planting annually, and it will project what it looks like and how quickly you've achieved carbon neutrality. The model currently assumes, unless you change the parameters, that you use any offsets as they're created. So you are offsetting some of your emissions prior to 2025 by retiring the carbon units as are generated. But if you just banked all the carbon credits that you generated and only use them from 2050, that changes the pattern of the how this displays, and that's going to happen shortly. what you happen is the blue lines will come deeper because you've gone more into deficit in terms of emissions to the atmosphere, but then you have more carbon credits available as surplus from 2050. Depending on the approach you take, that does impact on the number of carbon credits you might have surplus to sell because you don't need them to offset your emissions. So that's why I've included that in the model, just so that can be modelled as well, and any percentage thereof. Let's just go to the next slide because we can come back to this if anyone wants any further explanation. Now, this doesn't have animation. This shows
You just added the land drainage in.
Land drainage.
Yeah.
And the biggest thing to note is the y-axis. The axis is it went from 8,000 tonnes to over a million. I think it's over 1 million tonnes. No, it's 10 million tonnes. Because of the negative and positive. And this is showing what it looks like if you plant a huge amount of land. Now, this should only be treated as an indicative at this stage, all those, but it becomes a very useful model for testing the sort of approaches, and then it will help us also calculate the costs of some of these planting regimes, particularly when we're calibrated planting rates. So that's the theoretical side of it, but to really make this come home, what we need is to look at a number of case studies, and we're already exploring a range of case studies. So just go to the next slide. So we are looking at case studies based on planting council-owned land. Now that's primarily planting because most of your bare pastoral land is between the river and the berm as part of the flood protection scheme. A lot of that land is you have grazing licenses with the neighbouring farmers, so there are some encumbrances. There are some complications in planting in flood plains. So you have to be very careful about how much you might do and where you might plant any trees. But this is particularly where re-establishment of wetlands and things may have a role to play here as well. So we've got some case studies there. We're looking at a number of case studies where there's already consideration of land acquisition by the council because these are low-lying bits of farmland where it's getting incredibly expensive to pump and the cost of new infrastructure. So there may be a deal to have in terms of those farmers because they won't be able to afford the costs themselves of continuing to maintain the level of drainage to maintain production in some certain areas. So there might be a number of farms that you potentially could purchase. We know of one case where there's Maori land in the situation where it might be more of a partnership arrangement, looking at options for carbon biodiversity sharing and recreating wetlands and re-wetting these. These are largely peat, well, they're primarily peat soil areas, which would also have a benefit of, at the margin, reducing some of the peat soil emissions. We're going to look at potentially some other case studies as well, testing some of the other approaches. When we do the case, we've started on the case studies. When we look at it, it'll be the sorts of areas, the sort of planting regimes, what are some of the potential risks and barriers, and an estimate of the likely costs and benefits of some of those planting. But we've just really started on that journey of developing those case studies. But that's really to bring home what the council could actually do in practice. And in fact, some of those case studies might be the real projects that the council could take forward to help achieve its carbon neutrality basis. Now, let's, the next slide is, I think, the last. No, it's, no, there's still a number of matters to be resolved. How much of the land, are you, I'm assuming the council is probably fully committed to the public transport and your core emissions, offsetting all of those. How much of that much bigger chunk are you wanting to bite off? Because that will have a huge material impact on the costs of any offset regime. And what else might you do in that space to actually at the margin reduce some of those emissions. And that's probably largely our infrastructural strategy discussion in terms of how you run your infrastructure. Is the, what is the spectrum? What's your preferred planting regimes? Is it, are you going to go for the mixed options that have clear financial and co-benefits and, manuka honey, or are you wanting to largely focus on mainly carbon and biodiversity plays that achieve those? I think that's something to consider, particularly in the context of how this program should be influenced by the council's broader objectives of what it wants to achieve. And I think the final thing is you could spend a lot on lots of little projects, or you could do 2 or 3 quite meaty projects to achieve what you want to achieve. And there's some real benefits of simplicity and versus stakeholder engagement and things like that as well to achieve the plan. So with that, I want to finish there and open up to comments and questions.
Really appreciate that, Mike. Well, first light on is Councillor Dunbar-Smith.
Number of questions. Firstly, it's a very good report.
Yes.
I personally am very concerned about us spending money on the sustainable peatland business case, which is a largely academic exercise going to take 6 years, whereas this is actually practical solutions that seem to be available right now. And I can't see how those two align personally. So a couple of points. Talking to you earlier, turning lands back into wetlands, from what you were saying is that A, it releases methane initially, and B, it's a very, very slow process of reducing the carbon.
So what I'd say about wetlands is there's 2 sides to the wetland peat soil thing. They are currently on a per hectare basis a major source of emissions. So when you count that, there's some very clear benefits of taking some peatland out of the equation if it's practical and sensible to do that. The carbon benefit, the reason why you've got your very deep peat soils in the Waikato is hundreds of thousands of years of swamps in the Waikato. And they're built up over millennium. So that's why I don't know even how deep some of them are, but some of them are really
12 metres, I've heard.
really, really deep. The literature I've been able to access to date doesn't give a particularly clear story on the carbon benefits of planting, of re-wetting soils, other than the emissions reductions, which is a very clear thing. There is some countervailing things. There will be some methane, which would reduce the benefits of the vegetation planting around the wetlands. But having said that, I believe there's real benefits in re-wetting some of those soils and re-establishing. But the carbon benefit potentially on the offset side won't be as big as the emissions reduction benefit on the other side of the equation.
So therefore, if you look at your item number 35, one of the most effective things that can be done is offsetting peat soils is actually to tree plant. Tree planting is primary.
So if you're not going to treat the peat soils itself and you want to create a carbon offset, tree planting is one of the best.
So we're looking at possibly 25,000 hectares over 21 years if you're going to offset all of the.
What I'd say is we need to take those numbers with a huge grain of salt because they are very, very preliminary numbers. But I did that just to give you a sort of order of magnitude of the sort of size of the challenge relative to your other emissions. But you would require a lot of land to plant to achieve the target at 2050. If you planted that large amount to achieve that target at 2050, from 2050 you would have a lot of units to sell, surplus carbon units generated because those forests continue to grow. But it's the other element here, of course, is what is the regional economic effects of taking large areas out, from dairy production and other reasons as well. So that's all got to be factored into any equation in that space.
Well, I presume that if you're planting forests to offset, you do them in other areas so that therefore you're not taking dairy out of production necessarily.
You'd be looking for the sensible areas to plant it.
So with the high level of land drainage CO2,
Yeah.
given that the council is responsible for doing the drainage, it owns the drainage systems, is it liable for the CO2 emissions?
So at this stage, no, like it's like agricultural emissions. The country has not said it's going to sheet back emissions to farmers at this point, but looking to introduce methane and nitrous oxide potentially sometime in future. The whole issue of organic or any soils at the moment, the only way you can get credits for soils would be through the voluntary carbon market if you were doing things to, there's nothing you can do currently under the emissions trading system. It's not the emissions, while the country reports what's its projected emissions from its soils, it's not part of our NDC, our nationally declared commitment to emissions reduction, and that's because of the complexities there. So you don't have a liability in that someone's going to ask you to pay for your emissions because as a council you're doing this. But if you want to declare that you're carbon neutral, the issue is to what extent those emissions might be considered something to, sheet towards the council in achieving carbon neutrality.
So if you're looking at 1,200 hectares per year over 21 years, I've just looked up what it costs per hectare and analysis and suggesting $20,000 per hectare.
Yeah, like the numbers would be huge.
Yeah, well, you're looking at $24 million a year.
Yeah.
So that's a large additional rate rise.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I'm not advocating for you to do it. I'm just saying if you wanted to do it, that's what you would,
Giving us all the options.
Yeah,
Hence looking at what we own first.
But we might actually be forced. We might be forced to do this if we're doing the peatland study and we're highlighting nationally that Southland and the Waikato have 90% or whatever it is the emissions from greenhouse gases. Government might well decide that this needs to be addressed.
Don't because I might have got this completely wrong. So like there's a separate piece of work. In fact, the MFE reported to the previous government I think it was about August last year, updated inventory of the organic soils and the general soils emissions for the country, and effectively the update doubled the contribution of organic soils relative to the factors that have been used previously. My understanding of this, I might have got this completely wrong because I've only heard about this proposal. That is more about testing, getting a better, robust scientific picture of the benefits of re-wetting soils in terms of its carbon uptake and methane. But I may have got that wrong.
Yeah, did you want to comment anything on that, Pamela? Karen? If you just turn yours off for a sec, Ben, you can turn it straight back on. There we go.
Mike, that was my understanding as well. This is a work in progress and that it was information collected to help inform future decisions, and that this is something that the government is considering, but there is no sort of date for when we will have a determination of where it goes from here.
And I think that because the relevant, when I was looking at the information available domestically about the benefits of re-establishing wetlands, the only study I was able to find was one that it was a study that Manaki Whenua with AgResearch in Niua had done for the government based on re-establishing wetlands on farmland and whether farmers could get benefits from that. So it's got some really rough ballpark figures of the potential carbon benefits of doing that. But that did mention the risk of methane, reducing some of those carbon benefits. So that's why I referred to that study. I can point you to that study if you'd like to have a look at it.
Finally, you've got your arrows going this way with production forestry and biodiversity planting
Yes.
forestry. Presumably there are models that show the costs of each of those.
Like there'll be numbers for those, and we could try and model them all. That would require getting quite a bit of, we've got there's a Manuka option. Well, there's two Manuka options in there actually. One is a Manuka option where you're maximizing honey production, and the way that that's usually done is you grow up Manuka, and then when it gets to a certain point, you harvest it and then regrow it again. And there's a Manuka option where you're using that as a nursery crop, to progress to native forests.
Right.
And depending on which option you take, the costs and benefits and the financial, the short term and the longer term costs will change.
Hence looking at case studies, so you
Yeah.
can have a few options to price up, not everything.
Yeah, I'd
Yeah.
just say that the report's great and it advocates here effectively planting as an option as a way of mitigating. What I'd like to see is some financial numbers in there, not just tree numbers. And I note that the chief executive's KPI requires an implementation plan for adoption by June 2024 for this, includes the flood drainage activities. I'd like to see some dollars in there.
So the intention for a final report has to have indicative dollars for this. We
Right.
just haven't been able to do that
Mm.
work yet.
Yeah,
Thank you.
this is still the update. Thank you for that. Good questions. And Bruce, you're next on the list.
Yeah, so I'll deal with the Manuka option first before I go to the big issue, which I think unfortunately is way more complex than you're making out. First of all, the Manuka option, already Comvita is signing contracts around New Zealand for successional Manuka planting. It's happening already. It's been going for some time. And it is a very effective way of getting some short-term earnings, to compensate you for the land that you've retired or whatever. But in the end, they're progressively turning it back into native forest. Let's get to the wetland thing. So there's two sorts of restoration. One is active, where you spend lots of money and plant things and do heaps amount of work. And then, of course, I'm not sure whether the costs of the aftercare are built into the figures that are being presented today in the report, and the pest control, the massive cost of pest control. So yeah, active restoration is very costly, and what you're trying to do is find the sweet spot for where you can do various sorts of passive restoration, where nature can be generally assisted, and it sort of does the job for you. The issue about tree planting on peatland is that if you want to plant trees on peatland, you've got to be thinking about the bigger picture here. So to maintain tree planting on peatland means that the drainage systems have to remain in place. And this is where you get into the complexity of how you're managing emissions and locking up carbon or producing a little bit more methane, because yes, wetlands do that. So if you wanted to use the tree planting thing on the peatland soil, the real peatland soil, you're going to have to maintain the infrastructure for drainage. If you're going to use Pinus radiata, you see, it's way more complicated than you think. And actually, one of the reasons why the peatland research that's being promoted would be useful is that these complexities still are not well understood. So the question is, what is the level of drainage that would be need to maximize tree planting in a way that helps us with the carbon balance? I don't think that the answers for that are known very clearly at all. And so I'd be very hesitant, Ben, to just write off the peatland work in the way that you just did. You pretty well just said, oh, we don't need it. Well, don't agree with that.
But you did agree on outcomes and action. on the
Yeah, well,
ground.
you've got to have and you've got to
good point.
determine thresholds, and you've got to actually understand what you're doing as the management tool, what actual result it's going to give you. Because again, all we've got here is some extremely crude carbon balance figures based on estimates, but not on direct measurement of management treatments. The experiments haven't been undertaken. This is the point I'm trying to make. So I really like the report too, for the reasons that it lays out the initial state and gives us some ideas of what it might cost. But the costings, you know, for active restoration are likely to be higher than what are in the report because of the need for going to maintain trees on a landscape in permanent native forest. You've got to have the appropriate level of pest control. And you even need a decent level of pest control for establishing a good pine plantation. But because of the growth rates and the way that the pine operates, it's less costly than developing a permanent native forest restoration. These are all the nuances that you've just got to build them into the model. So the model that we've got is a good first start, but it just doesn't get us to the level of, you know, what are the thresholds of the management actions we need to undertake to get the reduction, the combined reduction in emissions by re-wetting of soils, which is a longer term, a way more longer term permanent solution than tree planting on peat soils.
Yeah, no, I
Way
don't think that was too much the intent. Right
Yeah.
place, right tree.
Yeah, so anyway, I just wanted to
necessarily the
introduce
same.
those complexities because I think this is a great start, but man, you've got to do a lot more thinking before you actually take the action on the ground.
Yeah, Bruce, I couldn't agree more. I probably should clarify a couple of things. So our assumption around peat soils was more restoration of wetlands with associated vegetation that would be wetland vegetation, you know, in the very low-lying areas of peat soils where water would be, you know, potentially, you know, occurring if you take out the drainage options. The costings to date, so our intention is to do initial costings of establishment and what would be a reasonable regime of, you know, management for pest and weed control to ensure, you know, you lock in the gains you would get. But we haven't done that work yet.
And again, to contrast that with a wetland restoration, so essentially a bit of re-wetting might be enough to start a natural process where the native plants actually recolonize the site. But the critical part, the critical threshold that needs to be achieved for that is the arrival of the long-term peat former, two species that have been massively restricted to the main core of Kōpuatai, Whangamarino, because they are the ones that actually continue to build the peat, albeit rather slowly, for approximately 12,000 years in the case of Kōpuatai, to get to the point where you've fully locked the carbon up. So again, it's just good. Anyway, it's less costly, I believe, to start the process of passive wetland restoration by doing simple things like blocking drains. Just go and block the drain. Bales of straw are widely used both nationally and internationally to do the blockage, just straw bale.
While thinking about everything and working through a process.
But again, it's the time frames, it's the thresholds, it's the different management implications that are not covered by the model as described.
It's got us to a starting point. Yeah. And for me, I mean, I'll just add before I go on to Stu. I'm not a huge fan of the whole net zero stuff. I think in my head, not zero. I think in my head, it's what the climate sees is the emissions that are too many right now. So I'm really in favor of reducing what's being put out rather than planting, which takes a long time to take it back in, just from an urgency point of view that I hear around. Saying that, this is a long-term project, as your graphs have shown, and so I'm really glad that we've made a start with it. I'm going to go on to Councillor Nebo, but I've got a couple more notes for later.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mike. I don't have any great pearls of wisdom. It's in some respects, the numbers are so outrageous that it just reinforces the need to be very careful about how we proceed forward. And I'm with Jen on that whole net zero thing. And again, these numbers reinforce that that's not a viable pathway anyway, you know.
I'm a fan of the work.
Pardon?
I'm a fan of the work.
Oh,
in general,
absolutely
yeah.
I am. Yeah, yeah. And, you know, don't get me wrong. And because if we don't have this work, we can't sort of strategize on a pathway forward. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Look, as I said, I don't have any great bills on them. This has sort of got me more thinking than it has
Good.
able to produce any useful commentary. But yeah, it's a good little piece of work and reinforces the need, I think, to keep doing work on so we know what we're dealing with. But I think too, one of the key messages, I suppose it does, in my opinion, demonstrate is that we need to be very, very careful when considering increasing the levels of service that we currently provide in terms of, and I know that's quite unpalatable for those who are who probably feel like production is potentially declining as things start to sink and that sort of thing, you know. But hey, I think that's just the reality of it. It reinforces the need to tread very, very carefully before we increase levels.
I can make a quick comment. I think where I was leading was, if we have limited resources, I would put them into reducing the peat emissions bar than into a whole lot of effort trying to offset things that look good in a pamphlet or in an annual plan. Yay, we're net zero, when we're ignoring the big bar. And some of you may not have seen before, there's a pretty big graph showing the relative proportion of it. And this council always has to weigh up, where does it put its resources? When you've got a roadmap with 109 commitments, where do you put your effort? And a bar as big as that is needing focus. But on the case studies, what I'd be really interested in with the various carbon sink options is the vulnerability of them, because a Pinus radiata gone overnight, Port Hills fire, for example, you know, or a storm come through, see the storm fall over near Taupo. The vulnerability of the various options would be really, really interesting to me, because I would hate to make a plan and we're all set to go, but then suddenly something comes along, like we saw in the first presentation of the day, and we've left the council with a liability because it wasn't a very robust solution. And on top of that, I really wonder whether some of the case studies can also have in them a way of having that not just generate biodiversity or carbon credits, but be of real tangible value to the community for a social cohesion reason, especially if we were to partner with TAs on, say, a green space that they walk through with a boardwalk, or different options for, say, a wetter piece of land, but we have figured out that a polluter of some sort can be done there, and it can be on sold as having a use other than just native or other forestry. I'll go on to Councillor Gruff.
Thanks. Just a question on what's the consequences if WRC doesn't meet its targets by 2050?
That's my understanding, the self-imposed targets, so
Yeah.
you know, it's reputational.
Yeah.
Is my understanding.
Doing what big organisations do is to be part of the team, isn't it? But it's all very internal. Karen?
Thanks.
Well, there are expectations on councils being reporting agencies under Zero Carbon Act, so we are expected to be reducing emissions
Under the
in line with
legislation.
the emissions reduction plan for New Zealand.
Doing our part. Okay. Councillor Dummersmith.
Could we go back to the slides that you just referred to where you see the graph?
Big
going-
bar graph?
Yeah.
Yeah. That was a cool one.
The original emissions graph? Or
Yeah, the
as
first
it-
one where we
yeah,
had a
Where it
animation.
flows along.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it was.
No,
It's that next one, that
Yeah.
one there.
It had
and
a
if you
play
push-
button.
So I just wanted to raise this for Robbie and Noel, that what we're looking at here is, you can see everything excluding public transport is the blue. And then when they add in public transport, you get the orange. And then we come to the next slide.
No, to do this.
You gotta- you gotta
run
run
the
through.
animation.
It's running, and it's running at a good pace, so we're good. But yes, blue is our corporate.
And at the moment, we're only tracking the blue, and we're considering the public transport
Yes.
as in being offset at 10 hectares planting per year, I think it is.
Yeah, we can bring up that other slide that
Yep.
summarised, just since there are others in the room now.
And
And here's the
there,
grey,
that's when we add in the impact of
the land drainage
peat,
emissions.
peat soil
Organic soils.
emissions.
That's why I said, you know,
So
it makes sense to
The
focus
question
there.
is the regional council responsible for offsetting that because we own the land drainage systems? And then what are the costs? No, but I mean, I'm saying someone has to pay the costs of offsetting that.
All right.
And
so
it's
if
looking
you're in
at
the green,
possibly $24 million a year,
jump to
maybe
that one
more,
with the
because as
3
Bruce is saying,
hectare
you've
options.
got the ongoing
Keep
thing.
going.
So I just wanted to raise that with you.
That
Just to imply, Bruce,
That
I'd
one.
anticipated that
Here you go,
the,
Ben.
the offset would occur in Tokoroa or somewhere else rather than on peatland. Didn't seem sensible.
And that's my assumption as well.
Yeah, and that the issue of flooding peatlands, which my concern is that by the time our study comes out in 2029, someone in Wellington will have decided that yes, we are going to actually include these, and that then they'll start to be added into emissions target reductions. We need to know the economic impact of what it is of shutting down that agricultural production as well. So I'm just saying that this is a good report. It just needs some dollars attached to it. And my concern was that the other one was much more academic and didn't have that.
Yeah, but the offsite offsetting has other complications, both in
Yeah.
terms of its maintenance and in terms of really addressing the key issue. And the key issue, of course, is about the emission coming from the peat soil. And the question is, how much land do you think you've got available to make up for this massive emission?
So we'll look at each one holistically in the, I'm sure in the case studies. Next step is to get the report towards the end of the financial year. Is that right? May? Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. I have one question and then I'll go to Pamela Story. Where is the blue carbon side of things at in your awareness? Because hear things from time to time that it can be more effective even than forestry.
So we
As a sink?
we have considered the blue carbon as a possibility. The challenge we've got at the moment is there's very little information on the carbon sequestration benefits in the New Zealand context. There's a little bit on
Research happening.
Yeah,
but
so there's
not
research.
yet.
There's been some trials in Australia. Some of the big international conservation agencies are playing in that space, but it's very, very immature. So you wouldn't want to bank what you're wanting to do on it. But there's other reasons why you might want to do it anyway.
Yeah, like our coastal
To
aims.
to improve coastal resilience and
Totally.
biodiversity.
I'll think of that as an emerging thing if you do this in a few years' time further.
Yeah, so at this stage, we're not actually proposing a case study on blue carbon unless you really want us to. But if we did, it would be very speculative.
No, that's all right. In time, I think that will be more robust. Councillor Story.
Kia ora. Just a question, and I'm not sure who it goes to, but I'm looking at, the point was made that we don't own drainage schemes, but we're reflecting the emissions that come off of as a result of our drainage operations, right? And I'm thinking about how, Fonterra is taking consideration of its scope 3 emissions. Our banking systems are considering scope 3 emissions.
It's the standard.
Where do we ensure that we're not double, triple counting the emissions? I think of the farmer who owns the peatland in Fonterra is saying there's emissions, the bank is saying there's emissions, regional council is saying there's emissions. So who ensures that we're not over offsetting if
I think that's a
offsetting
good
was
point.
the
Great question.
So my understanding is no one's claiming ownership of those emissions because it's too big.
but they're accounting for it though.
Are they? Like I know the
Oh,
accounting for methane and nitrous oxide emissions. I'm Not sure they are. They may be. I could be completely
In
wrong.
time, very much might be, because
Mm.
as the method for
Mm.
including organic
Right.
soils goes to Ministry for the Environment, and then it becomes a normal thing for everyone by 2030 to do, maybe,
Yeah.
but Councillor Kneebone has raised this in a previous session as well. It's a
Okay.
great question,
All right.
and I welcome more answers
Yeah.
from
The-
yourself or Karen.
the
Where
other
would
thing
our
I should,
answers come from on that? Or is that a message that this council needs to be sending to central government around ensuring that the frameworks that we're all operating under are not resulting in
Application.
yeah.
Can I just get a light for Karen? Thanks.
Thank you. This is definitely an area that we have asked a lot of questions, both of our partners in Landcare Research, people in government, very interested in the decisions the government makes about next steps with respect to these organic soils. And I was just going to say we are quite fortunate because Mike is on his way up to a meeting with representatives who are thinking about these very things, so he can ask all these questions and we can put it into some sort of formal submission in due course. I just wanted to say, councillors, though, picking up on your points about the complexity and about this just being a first step, that's right. What we're showing is here's our landscape, and it gives us the opportunity to start making the choices that actually allow us to have, it's not an either or, it's actually going to be a whole mosaic of all of these options so that we can cover the whole region. It's the right planting in the right place, but it's also how do we look at those revenue opportunities and do things differently, such as the land purchases, maybe in partnership with others, philanthropics. There are a whole lot of opportunities that we need to bring together. When we talk about the maintenance and the pest control, we have really advanced, mature programs. These people are already doing the work on this land, and maybe it's just by asking them to turn 4 degrees to the right to actually do the pest control there rather than there to ensure that we can achieve the outcomes sought. But when we come back with the costings, it will be with a much more holistic frame. But this is just the first step, and we will be overlaying all those other elements as we develop this framework.
Great.
Just one last point. I noticed that for this to start working, we're due to kick in by 2025. All the predictions are starting in 2025 to 2050. So presumably in a year's time, we'd be starting some of this.
And we, as Mike said, we pick off the sensible stuff that's easy to start. And you always have to start. It's about, we can say the what ifs, but let's take the least risk. Let's look for opportunity. And it is, the path of no regrets.
Yeah, and this committee is to, try and go through the first weeds of this to get it into a form that then will come to the whole council, obviously, for its opinion. And I'm going to go to Councillor Kneebone, being a member, and he's been thinking deeply, I can tell. And I'd invite if Councillor Cookson or Councillor Smith, who joined us a bit late, if you do want to say something in the meeting, absolutely go for it. You'll be next after Councillor Kneebone. But if you otherwise, I also invite you to talk to Mike directly afterwards, because I'm thinking we're almost all ready for lunch soon. So but very welcome.
Well, it was just a couple of comments, can't resist it, on the whole concept of who has responsibility for the emissions of our drainage operations, and it's completely perverse for a party to have responsibility for it if they don't have the control of how much they do, So in other words, we say to the targeted ratepayers, if you want a X level of service, then pay for X level of service. Therefore, that party should have responsibility for the emissions. Otherwise, it's just completely perverse. And I feel like some of that sort of stuff has to be nutted out. And it's no different to me getting a contractor in and telling to drain my private peatland, and then telling him he's got responsibility for the penalty. Yeah.
Councillor Smith.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I appreciate we've come into it partway through. My concern is the drainage. We own the pumps, but we do not own the land on which the drains sit, and that rests with the farmer. So it is of concern that council is taking responsibility, or could be taking responsibility. The other issue is we can't plant our way out of this problem. We've heard in another forum the amount of land that would have to be done, and it would basically make New Zealand bankrupt because we couldn't produce
Anything else?
something to income to run the country, so and gain income. So what I'm also concerned about is the silo effect of hearing this in the climate committee, where at what stage would this be shared with ICM? Because, and of course, with the infrastructure strategy, which is in the LTP, this is a whole of council issue, and I appreciate it's come through this committee, and would be interested in, and I'm happy to take that offline, as to
Next steps of where it goes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Mike,
Could I,
Last words.
just in terms of the last point, so, and it was in part of the presentation that you missed. So currently the commitment is carbon neutrality by your reducing direct and indirect council emissions, including public transport. And then the next one is using nature-based solutions to achieve the above objectives and work towards reducing and offsetting land drainage emissions. So you haven't actually at this point made a commitment to offset your land drainage emissions, but making some progress towards that. So that's, I just wanted to clarify that point.
no, appreciate both your clarifications actually. On that then, I'm keen to wrap it up since lunch arrived 10 minutes ago. I want to thank everyone for contributing, and I want to thank Leah for her first meeting with us and noting that I need to accept one more resolution. So if I just move that we receive this report by Mike, have a seconder in Councillor Kneebone. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. And then thank you, Karen, for putting this agenda together. I look forward to seeing you at our next meeting. We've made some comments throughout the meeting that we'll bring some things to you in the next meeting about how we work together with our TA partners. I'm looking forward to that. We'll have a closing karakia. I might, since Karen, since you opened, I might let you close for us as well.
Thank you. Onahia mai te urutapa nui, kia wātea, kia mama, te nākau, te teinana, te hinganaro, i te ara takatū, koe rā e rongo. E whakairia ake ki ronga, kia tina, haumie, huie, tākie.
Thank you, everyone. Meeting closed at 12:12. Appreciate your attention.
Apologies for running you late, Chair.